I want to talk this morning about ethics. It's so foundational to our practice, and I probably don't talk about it enough. And it is foundational because without living a life that is with an intention to minimize harm, everything else that we aspire to do in this practice can get jumbled up and not work well. So, this morning I want to talk about what I'm going to call morality, ethics, and our practice. And it's a territory that touches every one of us every single day in obvious and sometimes profoundly subtle ways. And I came to this path precisely because of how other faith traditions and other practices answered this question. And I want to share some of those reflections today to sort of look at it and inquire into it more deeply. As I've shared before, for those of you that have been here a while, one of the things that turned me away from the faith tradition in which I was raised and toward this practice were questions of morality. In my years of practice as a psychologist, I repeatedly saw the negative impact in people's lives of what we call the tyranny of the should. People bound by rigid rules that are rarely and end up not being very happy people. The shame that accompanies any failure to meet those standards, which can cause great self loathing, great suffering, the very antithesis of what the Buddha offered us in his teaching. So I want to get into that today and talk about why these rigid moral systems cause such suffering. And it's not just that the rules are too strict. It's that they externalize our choices. They externalize our moral agency. They take it out of our hands. They tell us that goodness is compliance and badness, however we define it, is disobedience. And what this does, it creates a psychology of surveillance where we're constantly under surveillance by this sort of overarching conscience. An internalized judge who watches, who evaluates, who condemns. And what does it produce? It doesn't produce genuine compassion, in my view. It doesn't produce authentic kindness. It produces fear of punishment, fear of being found out as bad, fear of our own humanity, fear of our flaws. The Buddha saw this clearly. That the Dharma is not a system of divine legislation. It's an invitation to wake up. And in my understanding of the Buddha's teachings, we don't have commandments. We have intentions. We set intentions, which moves the locus of control from some outside authority that's judging us to within, to our own hearts and conscience. And if you think about this, step back from this moment, this is a radical shift, a radical act, because it puts the onus on our own reflection, our own discernment, our own inquiry, into a personal moral code. And what does this mean practically? Well, when we set an intention, let's say we set the intention, a broad intention to do no harm, we are not obeying some command. We are making a choice. We are saying, I have looked at the nature of suffering. I have seen how harm reverberates through our lives, including my own. And from that understanding, I make a commitment to non harming. And that's a broad umbrella, and we'll talk about it some more in a moment. But this morality is born of wisdom and discernment. It's not born of fear. The five Buddhist lay precepts, just a quick reminder of them: no killing or harming, no lying or false speech, no sexual misconduct, no stealing, and no abuse of intoxicants. This is a starting point, just to give us a kind of jumping off place for this inquiry. They are not the ceiling of our moral life; they are the floor. This is a sort of foundation to orient us, to give us a direction. But the number and the complexity and the range of moral decisions that we encounter every day requires much greater discernment, much greater nuance. And it's effort. It's not easy. It's not just saying if you follow these rules, the black and white, everything will be hunky dory. This is where the path becomes genuinely challenging and difficult. And I don't for a moment this morning want to minimize that difficulty. It is more difficult than just following someone else's rules. And I'm not saying we throw those out. I'm just saying we come to them with an open mind and with some discernment. And the reason this is so important is because, again, our old friend, the ego. The ego, we humans have an endless capacity to rationalize and justify any behavior. The ego demands that we protect it from self-criticism, from self-condemnation, by justifying all kinds of choices and behavior. But that's often rooted in ignorance. We would rather act badly than risk looking badly. And this is where our practice does not is our meditation practice. It's just not merely a relaxation technique or a stress reducing tool, although it is those things. It is the foundation of this moral life. Because when we sit in meditation, we cut through the ignorance, we cut through the delusions, we see things clearly. We see the stories we tell ourselves to justify our harmful behavior. We catch the moment when that rationalization begins. It has this seductive whisper, oh, you're okay, it's someone else's fault. Or it's okay that you did that, you deserve that, you're entitled to that, on and on and on. It's fine, they deserved it. It wasn't that bad. Everybody does it. You know the drill. All of those rationalizations. The ego loves those. If we are not brutally honest with ourselves, if we're not willing to shine that flashlight into the dark corners of who we are, then we can easily and unknowingly go off the rails with our moral decisions. This is why the Buddha emphasized mindfulness, sati, S-A-T-I, not as passive awareness, but an active, courageous attending to what is actually happening in our hearts and minds. Now, are there absolutes when it comes to morality? Um, yes, but but I'm agnostic about whether which of these are agnostic. Some things we just have to decide on our own. Is killing ever justified? Are other forms of harm ever justified? These are not easy questions, and I'm not pretending they are. They are, but and they're not easy because we crave certainty. We don't like ambiguity. We want it gone. And most faith traditions, I would argue, exploit this need, but not Buddhism, at least as I understand it. Our path asks us to develop what the poet John Keats called negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainty without reaching after fact and reason in an anxious grasp for solid ground. Let me say that again. This capacity, it's so hard to remain in this capacity uh, of uncertainty without reaching after fact and reason in an attempt to have some solid ground. This is profoundly counter to our culture. We live in a world that demands moral certainty, that speaks in absolutes and rewards those who speak in absolutes, that punishes nuance as weakness. But this is all contrary to the Buddha's middle way. The middle way between rigid moral absolutism on the one hand and nihilistic anything goes on the other. In between that is this path of wise discernment. It's not anything goes on the one hand or rigid morality on the other. It's this middle way of wise discernment. A general theme of not harming becomes our guiding light. Is this situation, are these words I'm about to speak going to cause harm? Is this action I'm about to engage in going to cause harm to myself, to others? But even that leaves unanswered deeper questions. For example, I don't eat meat, but I wear leather. Okay, so how do you reconcile that? I mean, obviously the harm is still there in the killing of that animal. This is precisely why our practice is so important, because it's so subtle and nuanced. If we are willing to forego rigid absolute rules, the Persian 13th century Persian poet Rumi, I love this quote from him. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I will meet you there. Now, this quote is not about moral relativism. It's not saying nothing matters. I think it's pointing to something that the Buddha pointed to, that when we drop beneath these conceptual frameworks, beneath our judgments and categories, there is a quality of the human heart that naturally moves toward compassion and non-harming, that naturally recoils from causing harm. But it gets covered up by all this noise and cultural baggage because we see the interconnected through our practice and the wisdom we develop. We see the interconnection of all things. This field that Rumi talks about is not where morality disappears. It's where morality comes alive because we really have to engage in the inquiry. We have to be responsive. We have to be present because arising freshly in each moment from a heart that's trained in attention and softened by practice. So today, I'm advocating for this inquiry. Just notice going forward next week when you act from a should, from fear, from this internalized judge. And then notice when you act from intention, from clarity, from not harming, from the understanding of interconnection. Feel the difference in your body. We contract very often when we're acting from a should. We sort of pull in because of the fear of the consequences, the fear of the punishment. Punishment is not, it's the carrot and stick argument. The carrot is much, we know this, I speak as a psychologist now, a much more effective learning tool than the stick. Yes, the stick temporarily suppresses the harmful behavior, but it doesn't get rid of it. It's why corporal punishment is not necessarily is not an effective child rearing technique. When we come from this intention of non-harming, we feel the difference in our body, we feel it in our heart, and most importantly, we feel it in the quality of our actions. And when we stumble, and we all do, we meet that stumble not with shame, not with self-condemnation, but with the same compassionate curiosity that we bring to everything else in this practice. Oh, look, there it is. Let me look at this. What happened? What was I protecting? What was I avoiding when I did that harmful thing? Not in a self-judging way, but as a teaching way. What can I learn from this? This is the living practice of morality through the eyes of the Dharma. Not a checklist, not a series of rigid rules, not commandments, not something if I break it, I'm going to burn in hell for eternity, not performance for some cosmic judge hanging out there, but an ongoing, humble, courageous inquiry into how we might cause less harm. If we carry around as our intention non-harming, the blanket umbrella of non-harming, it will direct us to making the best choices and bring more kindness into a world that is so desperate for it, more so now than ever. So those are some broad thoughts today on sort of the ethics of our practice.